Hello, everyone arriving in. We are just waiting for the stream to start. Aha, it looks like the live stream out to our socials has begun as well. Wonderful. Okie doke. Well, welcome back, everyone, to another week of Reasonings with Jane. Before we begin, as always, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting here this evening. Tonight, our special guest, Craig, and myself are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and Jane is coming to us from the lands of the Camaragal people. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and I would also like to extend a particularly warm welcome, as always, to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here tonight as viewers. Wherever we are all zooming in from, wherever we are across Australia, we are all on First Nations land, and sovereignty was never ceded. So, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Reasonings with Jane. I'm Hannah Ma, and tonight I will be facilitating the Q&A at the end of the webinar. And as always, our host tonight is Reason Australia's lead candidate for the Senate in New South Wales, the magnetic Jane Caro. Welcome back, Jane.
Yes, it's awful. Things stick to me as I walk around.
And joining Jane tonight is our special guest, Craig Foster. So Craig is former captain of the Socceroos and is also a member of the Australian Multicultural Council and a human rights activist. In March, Craig made a blistering speech to the National Press Club about Australia's brutal refugee policies and treatment, in which he asked some uncomfortable questions that really challenged this notion of fairness being an essential part of our national character. So tonight, Jane and Craig will reflect on some of the irony, perhaps, of our harsh line on those who come to Australia by boat, considering our national history, and also discussing what a humane asylum seeker and refugee policy could look like in Australia. And of course, we will be holding a Q&A as well. So if you have any questions, you can pop them into the question and answer section, not in the chat. There is a separate button there with Q&A on it. And at the end of the session tonight, I'll jump back in and ask your questions to Jane and Craig. But until then, please sit back, relax, and enjoy. And over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Hannah. And I'm very excited to have Craig as my guest this evening because, as Hannah said, I was absolutely inspired by your speech, Craig, at the National Press Club. And you know, your passion for human rights is absolutely electrifying. And I think it makes us all think more deeply about something that I think we sometimes say, oh, yes, I'm for human rights, but we don't actually think about what that means, what responsibilities that entails. And I think that's something that you obviously do. But I want to know, before we get into that, where does that passion come from? Was it a conversion, or have you always felt this way?
Thank you, Jane and Hannah, for that lovely introduction. And I'm very pleased to join you. As magnetic as you are, I know that you are very magnetic. That's very true. So it's a particular thrill to be with you tonight. In terms of my background, you know, it's a difficult question to answer. You know, I don't know if it's some of that must come from family, and my parents were very strong influences on all of their children. They had three sons, and also I think the region, and it's certainly not exclusive to country regional areas. But when I grew up, there was a very strong sense of community there, in a place called Lismore.
Where was it? Sorry,
Lismore.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah. So everyone has seen the strength of that community, you know, in the harshest of times recently. You know, when the floods hit and pretty much wiped out the whole town, and people, you know, jumping in dinghies and rescuing others that they didn't know, actually literally putting their lives at risk. And that is my memory of the area, is of people working together, people coming together, particularly through sport, the prism of sport, where I spent most of my young life. And people, this sense of volunteerism and community service that was reflected through sport was extremely strong. So we were involved in a range of sports. My father was a talented tennis player and a cricket player, and we played football. And so across those three sports, and we played basketball and many other things, something always needed doing. And in that country era at that time, I'm not sure if to what extent it still survives today, but people would just do it. The people on the street would do, my father is a big fisherman, for example. And for the last 50 years, he'll go fishing, he'll come back and, he and my mother, Deanne, they only need 5 fish. And so he'll just walk up and down the road, just handing out the rest of the fish that he's got, which is completely normal because that's the neighbors.
Mm.
So people cared for each other. They generally didn't have to lock their houses. People would look after all of their, each other when they're away on holidays and all these things. And I remember many, for example, working bees particularly strongly because I didn't enjoy that much being involved in them. So I remember really well. My father was a very handy man. He was a mechanic and he came off a farm in a place called Jigai. And so, he would go, the local football club would need to build a new fence, or they would be creating a new actual ground out of a paddock. And so they would need to flatten it. They would need drainage. And so all of the locals would come. And of course, the kids had to come as well and, and get the dirt out. And that was just natural. That was totally natural. And then when I moved into later football in my mid-teens at representative level and started traveling, I then started to see a lot more inequality than I had seen in my, it was kind of limited and very sheltered upbringing in Lismore. We're very much within a family bubble, a very big extended family, spending every weekend together and so on. So it's very important to everyone. And then I started to see inequality. I saw much more First Nations disadvantage through the prism of sport. So, sport would have programs with these kids and I would go and help. And then I would very quickly start to be drawn to it. Well, I need to spend more time here. And how is it that these people, haven't had the opportunities that I have?
Yeah.
And so then refugees was one of those. And so naturally you would then start to lend your brand. So, well, people would ask to be ambassador, which is normal. And then I would say, yeah, look, that's fine. But as soon as I started to get embedded, I started to get really pulled in, often to the detriment of my football career, actually, because I always found it very difficult just to focus only on just going training and going and playing. My sensibilities were always much broader. And so it just went from there to, just evolution and I guess a sense of, and just growing and evolving and learning what problems are.
Yeah, it sounds like you were brought up to value connecting with other people. I mean, that's really what a sense of community means, isn't it? You make connections and those connections are without judgment. They're just another person and therefore you connect with them and therefore if you can help, you do. To some extent, maybe to a large extent, though I hope not, have we lost that? I mean, I agree with you that Australia's refugee policy is cruel and I also think that it is shameful. And yet it appears to be a vote winner. Why? Why do you think that is?
There are a number of reasons. Firstly, if you like, triggering of the Australian population and exclusion and marginalising a particular group and demonising them and turning the Australian population broadly, not everyone, of course, but we're talking in broad brushstrokes, against a particular group is actually part of our history. And I wonder how much of that, and I kind of assume that being a large island is central to that. And there, in 1788 and even prior to, but particularly then, Australia colonized and invaded by boat. And since that time, I mean, pre-federation and federation was very much, as historians would all know, and I'd imagine most of your listeners would know, federation was very much based on these colonies, what we now call states, coming together to exclude Chinese and Pacifica workers.
And Indigenous people too.
And
Indigenous people.
Yeah.
Kind of with the flora and fauna, I think.
That's right. And so in the goldfields in particular, Ballarat and elsewhere, Chinese labour, there was quite a significant amount here, and Australians were very challenged by that. And many of the themes of those times in the kind of 19th century, early 19th century, are mirrored today. And so then we went through the early time, of course, of White Australia policy, which, let's not forget, lasted until only like 40 years ago, formally. But, that policy was there pretty much since the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901. So the first piece of legislation that Australia actually struck, which makes sense when you understand why these groups, disparate groups and colonies came together to federate, was really to exclude people. And so the first piece of legislation was to keep people out, to restrict people who were non-white European, essentially. And that lasted for around 70 years. Now, that is still a part of, naturally, that's a part of our psyche, because that's part of our institutions, it's part of our cultural and social life, even if we don't like to admit it. And what happens is you can go through the whole a chronology of post-Federation Australian life, and periodically prime ministers and immigration ministers have used xenophobia to trigger the Australian population for political gain. And that might be Indo-Chinese boat people, Vietnamese boat people. I mean, in 92, Keating brought in mandatory detention. It wasn't yet indefinite. It was supposed to be for, I think, a maximum of 276 days or so. And that was quickly rescinded once the legislation was in, sadly. But even that was a big step in 92. And that's how far backwards we've gone in only 30 years for a variety of reasons. But, you can go, Sudanese youth gangs. How many examples are there? The Cambodians, of course.
Lebanese gangs and the Cronulla riots.
Exactly. Exactly. And look, Peter Dutton only last year. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say we've got a sorry history, in fact, when you think about it.
Yeah, and Peter Dutton was Home Affairs Minister, and disgracefully, I think only last year, perhaps the year before, said something like, "Oh, well, the Lebanese immigration was a mistake."
Oh.
And so and in Australia, sadly, these things are still able to be said, by leaders of Australian political life. And there is a section of Australia who resonate to that. I only say it because it works, as you said at the start. I do think that, so it's a big challenge to overcome these things. And I just see refugees who we have effectively tortured. And for those who don't know, since, 2013, when, almost the last 9 years, where we warehoused people offshore and basically tortured them, the International Criminal Court ruled that our treatment of those innocent asylum seekers and subsequently refugees constituted a cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Now, the instrument or the provision is about torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. They stopped short of characterizing it as torture improperly, in my view, because I know many of the people, and I know that it was, if anything, it was certainly torturous. So we're here, and I'm committed to telling the stories of those people fundamentally and trying to talk to Australian people, but by not taking their voice, I'm trying to lift up as much as possible those who have experienced that imprisonment and torture. And in fact, I keep saying to many of them who are my very good friends now, my job is to make you famous in Australia. I want to, because I believe that when Australia gets to know them and know their story and actually resonates with the humans, it's going to be much more difficult to do it again.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right. I do agree that we have, particularly, I think, mentally tortured a lot of these people. What do you say to the argument that is so often trotted out, which I find obnoxious in the extreme, and I have my own answer to it, but I'm also very curious to know what yours is, when people say, but we're stopping people drowning at sea?
Yeah. So firstly, there are different ways to stop people drowning at sea. One of the ways is to actually pick them up and not let them drown. Yeah. And that's kind of been forgotten in the last, 9 years, or even prior to that, back to 2001 and the Tampa and others. And so when these boats were actually coming, it wasn't necessary for them to get all the way to the shore and start crashing on the rocks. And Australians should recognise that, right? Because today, actually, what they call boat turnbacks is actually picking them up.
Right.
So there's a real question around, Australia's conduct at that time as to whether those boats actually needed to, people actually needed to perish, so close to land. Secondly, that's kind of right at the heart of this great artifice, this infrastructure of we got to keep everyone out and everyone is illegal, and this terminology that's used and so on. The simple reality is that obviously people have a right to flee, but the key moving forward is for Australia to work with our regional partners to firstly have them recognise the Refugee Convention, and secondly, rather than spending billions of dollars offshore to I shouldn't say warehouse. A warehouse is a nice thing that where you have boxes, it's a prison, to imprison innocent people who have overwhelmingly been rightly found to have been fleeing persecution. So we literally tortured actual refugees. And of course, what subsequent governments have had to try and tell the Australian people is that they weren't, because otherwise it's impossible to justify doing what we did to them. You have to somehow you have to firstly try and keep them silent, which is why I'm committed to lifting up their voices and telling the true stories. Secondly, you need to keep the media and the doctors and others quiet. So they have to be invisible. To the extent that they're visible, it's impossible to sustain, the type of treatment that we perpetrated on these people.
That's interesting because the family who were taken from Biloela and who are now languishing, I mean, they're no longer on Christmas Island. I think they're in Perth, but they're still in detention to all intents and purposes. That's been a tougher one for the government, hasn't it? Because we see them, we know them, the people of Biloela. It reminds me a bit, when I think about the people of Biloela have been such champions for that family, of the story you told about your beginnings and your childhood in a wonderful community-minded place. Strikes me that this is very much the same, and that once Australians put the individual to the group, they are. And the fighters for the family have been so dogged. I saw them asking questions only last week on Q&A, and I take my hat off to them. But the government is so intransigent. Has it become a situation where they simply can't climb down?
Yes, there is some of that. When a government, and a conservative government, says that people aren't coming here, and the last 20 years has been about the securitization of Australia's immigration policy. So we moved from immigration, and part of immigration is people seeking asylum,
humanitarian intake,
and even people who, so humanitarian intake is a kind of human lottery where people are often a decade and more in these camps somewhere in the world, and Australia should be at the forefront of, I think, because that's coming apart at the seams, this global compact about how to help people. And with climate change increasing, the displacement of people is accelerating. And so what grieves me, and what I was saying in the press club speech, is that Australia's actually been at the forefront of breaking the international norms of human rights regarding refugees and their right to seek safe harbour, right to flee persecution. Post-Second World War, it became obvious to everyone that people must be able to get out in a situation where, they're being persecuted, or conflict, or whatever the case is. And so what Australia's done in the context of, post-Tampa, when John Howard lied about, children being thrown overboard, which was one of the most cynical and corrosive lies in our recent political history anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
If not our entire political history, because he turned it from what could have been just characterized as, we know the vast majority of these people are seeking asylum, and we do have a problem here in relation to people smugglers and so on, and we need to find a sane way to deal with this. It turned it from that into, we're going to shut shop, we choose what happens, and we're going to break the international compact on seeking asylum. And that is what we've done. We've now exported this concept of offshoring imprisonment of people to the UK. They've just done a deal with Rwanda. And so this has now become one of our greatest, lowest, but most significant export legacies to humanity has become... And coal, of course. But this is, both go to the nature of humanity and human rights, the right to a safe and livable planet. What we have been systematically destroying the compact that we were one of the first countries to sign up to. That is the actual reality. And what it shows is, if you introduce the two big issues, of fear and security, which are basically, interchangeable, into the mind of populations everywhere, including Australia, and we do have, maritime borders all around us, and we had, the Second World War, and we had Japanese, coming to Darwin and Singapore and so on. So, the post-Second World War push for expansion of population by, I think it was about an additional 7 million people or so on, was all based on the fact that Australian politicians were saying, if we don't populate, we will perish. And the reason that we will perish, they were saying, is because the Japanese are clearly going to invade us. So there was this concept of the yellow peril coming down. And so when I hear politicians today use this type of language, it really disgusts me, because there's many ways to have this conversation without using that language. And the most cynical politicians, we've got many today, use this constantly because they know it works, but it harms people. It actually kills people. And so when you talked about, have we lost our ability to actually care for others, whether it's in our street or elsewhere? I think we are. COVID kind of brought that back, because people had to now, they were based in our homes, those of us who are lucky to have one, and who have a safe environment and aren't on the streets. We all of a sudden were in proximity to people, and people were, do you remember at the start of COVID, they were sending boxes of food down to people who they knew were, didn't have enough. And so there was a resurgence of this. But at national, at political level, we're still stuck in the, well, we just don't really care about anyone. We don't care about the Pacific Islands. We don't care that they're going to sink. We couldn't give two stuffs.
We only care when they make a deal with China, and we worry that they might put a military base. And yes, we appear to be unbelievably self-interested at the moment. I suppose in a way the problem is that the voters, we the voters, I'm going to say we, have to some extent brought it on ourselves, because John Howard won the Tampa election. Kim Beazley was all set to take over. And by leveraging fear of the other, John Howard won the government. And so we rewarded that behaviour with giving government to the Liberals, and they've regarded that as a kind of formula for hanging on to the government ever since. And it's so freaked out the Labor Party that Kim Beazley lost that they have also completely drunk the Kool-Aid when it comes to, Kevin Rudd made shameful messages all over our region telling people not to come. I'll never forget hearing one when I was overseas and feeling desperately ashamed of being Australian. Just to move on to something a little bit more positive, because I agree with everything you're saying, but, one of the things that does give me hope are the number of prominent people who are vocal about this. Obviously, you're one of the shining lights, but Brian Brown has been very vocal about it. There have been plenty of people who have spoken up about their horror and disgust, and there are groups as well, Grandmothers for Refugees, all sorts of people who work really hard. But there have also been quite a few prominent sports people who have championed human rights, and not just in Australia either. I mean, we've had Marcus Rashford in the UK shaming the government about poverty and hunger and food banks and all that kind of thing. And also, what was his name? The Black American player who took the knee for Black Lives Matter. Yeah, that's it. And also, I do want to give a little shout out to Ian Chappell, who was a very early champion of refugees and a very early critic of the policies we've just been talking about. What is it about sport that brings out not just physical champions, but let's say compassionate champions as well?
That's a good question. Look, Ian, as you rightly say, he took what for all of you and everyone listening and all of those speaking out back in the early 2000s when I wasn't, I was preoccupied with my career and with other issues, whether it was First Nations or others. He took what at that time was a very courageous stance, because Australia had lurched into this, zone where even talking about refugees in the way I'm doing today would have been extremely difficult and far more challenging than it is today. So, you use the word shining light. I don't think that's, I'm not sure about that, but it's much easier to do what I'm doing now than it was, when we have these crises. At the height of the crises, that's when it takes real courage. And, they're the people where I look back and go, okay, that is great, and that's what I remember. People who are prepared to go against the grain, because with the preponderance of media and the lack of diversity of media in Australia, of ownership at the moment, which is a really critical issue and has been a huge key to what's happened with refugees. We might talk about that in a moment. People knew they were going to be attacked. They knew, and not just on social media, but actually in the popular press. In the preponderance of the press,
where most of my attacks have been,
right. and so many on women, like yourself and Julia Gillard and all these things.
Yasmin Abdel-Magid,
and so that's why last year was so important. Having Grace Tame, I thought, she was just really extraordinary, and you've been fighting and been vocal in this space for many time, and strength comes in different ways. You're all incredibly strong. Grace, I think, just also had the kind of the voice to the next generation, and she has a way of very skillfully and cleverly and articulately breaking down the system itself that we all know exists. I mean, even in the refugee space, they're in trying to speak to Australia about it, you're always trying to find messages that can resonate and not alienate too many people, right? And so people, I don't know, last year or the year before, the Australia Day Council gave me an AM, and people said, oh, that's wonderful. I said, you know what, the truth is, it's very nice because I can use it for more social capital, which is why I accepted it, even though I'm a Republican. But however, I said to them, look, the reality is, if the Australia Day Council is giving me an AM for refugee advocacy, I'm clearly not doing it well enough. That's the truth.
Mind you, they gave me an AM for feminist advocacy as well. So there must be a few, left-wing moles in that council who get a few crumbs thrown at them every now and
again. Well, perhaps. But I mean, you have to upset the government at times. It's not possible. People are literally dying. They are literally rotting, wasting away in our detention centres, many for over a decade. And I'm not talking just about the Medivac refugees here. And so the more that I am in touch with them, the more that I just, I was constantly interrogating my own advocacy, just saying, look, are you doing enough here or what? It's, you can tell the stories and you can frame it in a nice way, but these people are dying. They are dying. We are taking their life force from them. And I'm an optimist. I'm just explaining where I think we are. I'm incredibly optimistic. I think the next generation is extraordinary. But I do think one of the biggest factors that we have today that played into the refugee torture is the lack of media diversity.
I was just going to ask you about that. I mean, I agree with you. I think that
Yeah.
Australia is in a dark place in terms of being able to have a fourth estate that tells us
Yeah.
the truth and that speaks truth to power.
Yeah.
That seems to be dwindling, and it's quite
Yeah.
scary, really.
It's very scary because it's being fueled by a range of not even organizations, people, you know. So we're all struggling, I think, and seeking to find people that we can trust in the public space who we know aren't trying to take advantage of us, genuinely have our interests at heart, and are actually going to tell what they perceive to be the truth. And have the courage to actually hold power to account, which is a great skill, right? Because power corrupts everyone. Well, it seeks to bring people inside, and there are advantages to being inside. That was what I loved about Grace so much, is because Grace is saying, I don't need to be on the inside. I know that there's huge benefits. Many people take those as financial benefits, but there are others. There is access to power. There is status, awards. All of those things come from just doing enough, but being happy to be, part of and not expose people. And we need more people with the courage just to say, look, it doesn't matter for me. Whatever the future holds, I hold this as so important, and women's rights is a really important one, that I am prepared to risk my future social capital or financial capital, whatever the case is, on this and other issues. Because this actually is what life is about. It's not about, it's about helping these people who are in danger to have what we have.
Yeah. Well, you, like me, are also passionate about public education. And I stuck my neck out about that for decades. It's not as dangerous as standing up for refugees, but nevertheless, it is one of the most radical positions you can take in Australian society, which is bizarre. The idea that universal access of all children to a decent level of education is somehow a radical position.
Extraordinary. Yeah. Would you like me to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. Why are you passionate about public education? Where'd you go to school?
Yeah, not only because I came through public education, that's really not necessary.
But we want to claim credit for you anyway, Craig. Talk about values.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I just think that it's a right of every kid. So, I have three amazing children, and throughout their school life, they've done what I didn't do, and that is they have crossed between public and private at various times. And so I've seen both sides of it, and I've also seen how the system drives all of us into private education. And many of those schools are outstanding. They're very costly, the best in the country. And what I say is, look, this school is just really amazing. However, every child, what aggrieves me is that every child doesn't have that opportunity. I have a daughter who's 15 now, and she currently goes to a school here in Sydney that everyone would know is called Ascom. And I love that education. And the reason I send her there is because I want her to have the greatest opportunity through education possible. But that school should be available to everyone.
Well, certainly the resources and the opportunities should be available to everyone.
That's exactly right. And it's not. Sorry, go on.
So, well, it struck me that there's a bit of a theme in Australia then. And what it is about is exclusion, isn't it? We talked the big picture. This is an island. Those of us who are lucky enough to be here now say we're going to exclude anyone else who wants to come. I think it was John Howard, wasn't it? We will decide who comes and the manner in which they come, blah, 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 blah. So that's all about exclusion, exclusivity. And in our education system, we laud the same thing. A lot of the reasons why some of those schools are so good is because they can exclude anyone who has any difficult problems or behavioural issues or whatever, and so forth, and just shove them onto the under-resourced system that has no choice but to take them. It's like what is it about Australia that we need to keep shutting people out?
Yeah, I don't know culturally, but it does worry me. But education is one of the most fundamental human rights you can possibly have. And therefore, People can make whatever choice it is that they want to make, but every child must have access to the highest level of education for free in Australia. And we have obliterated that. And I just think it's absolutely disgusting. And so I spend a lot of time with, so many multicultural communities and newly arrived communities and refugees, and they do not and cannot have the opportunity that other children, including my daughter or my other children at various times of their education life, have. And that is wrong. It's just fundamentally wrong. So it's a system at the moment. We have a class system of education.
Yeah, we've used our education system to create a class system, which is actually the opposite of what an education system is meant to do, because it's actually meant to break down barriers between people, not create them.
Totally.
I know we've got to go to questions from the floor in just a minute, but I want to ask you one last question before we get to that. You talked a bit about the rise of women and how important that was, and people looking for somebody that they can trust to speak up and speak truth to power. How do you feel about this election and what's going to happen, and the rise of the independents, particularly in the House of Representatives seats, that are causing a great deal of angst, it seems, in the media we've been talking about, and perhaps also amongst some of the government MPs?
Yeah, great. So can we just return briefly to this question of media? So is that okay? In 2017, I think it was Turnbull's government who wound back some of the media ownership diversity laws. And that was shocking. And so we now have a position where a News Limited, and Rupert and now Lachlan Murdoch basically own 70% of the Australian public mind. And I've seen in the refugee space, and we have clearly seen in the climate denialism area, we've seen in terms of women's rights, and the portrayal and sexism, misogyny, and how people are treated, and how that bleeds into broader society. And people don't really question it because it's in the paper every day. People realize that's just normal, right? And so you can normalize really horrible things. And what occurred to the refugees in Australia and those who came here is just purely propaganda. There was a new level of language used, new terms. It was completely changed to characterize them as immoral, as improper, and so many things, right? And that infects the mind over a long period of time. And I keep saying in many talks, I speak to wonderful Australians, and when I mention that area, many of them, or those who are opposed in some way, they say exactly the same things. Okay. And those things have come directly out of what they've read and been told on various television and media. And in this campaign, we've seen once again the partisanship, the naked bias, and the just sheer protection and promotion of some of the current government. Just a couple of days ago, we saw Josh Frydenberg, sprayed across all of the front page.
Part of his life.
Yeah. Exactly. And so my feeling is this: I don't care which side of the political line you're on, that's wrong. And so part of this next government should be, and I know we had a Senate inquiry into it recently, but it should be re-strengthening of media diversity laws, because if we go back and prosecute what Rupert Murdoch did through his organisation to climate denialism in Australia, he has set us, and therefore by definition the world, back a very, very long way. And it's compromised any opportunity Australia's had to actually take some leadership on the issue, and it's us that it's cost. Today there was a climate map released by the Climate Council of Australia, where people are able to put in their postcode and see by 2030 what is likely to be happening in terms of their insurance premiums and others. With extended, I think, extreme weather and also rising season. It's us that are bearing the cost. You've seen what's happening in my place in Lismore. These extreme weather events, and of course, rightly, the New South Wales government has now finally has created a commission to rebuild public infrastructure and so on, we are going to pay the cost. Now, we also have to make sure that the polluters pay it, but that's another issue for all of us citizens, right? But it's going to cost us trillions of dollars to repair what doesn't need to be broke. The other thing, and that's because of this climate denialism that's been hoisted on everyone, and what can only be called propaganda, anti-science propaganda. But the other thing that I'm really worried about is that the mining community and fossil fuel mining community of Australia, wonderfully decent people and fully entitled to be doing what they have been doing, they're the ones who are going to suffer. Because by not preparing and retraining, it's these people. So now we're in this binary area where our mining, industry and our employees are going, oh, well, everyone is attacking us. Actually, we're not. What we're saying is, I'm absolutely thrilled for my taxes to pay for your retraining because it's better for my daughters going forward vis-a-vis the environment. And I believe that you deserve it anyway, because, this mining industry has been so important to, the economic well-being of Australia for so many decades. But guys, it's over.
Yeah, it's over.
But we want to help you.
Yeah, I know. I don't know why that message can't get across because there are forces at work that don't want it to get across.
That's right.
Therefore it doesn't. And powerful forces at that. Now, I think we do have to go to some questions from our viewers. Hannah will masterfully, magnetically wrangle those questions.
Sure. Let me just attract some questions to me right now.
Yeah.
And of course, if you would like to ask any questions, anyone in the Zoom chat, you can pop that in the Q&A section. But for those who are watching on Instagram or Facebook, if we have someone ask a question right here, in fact, that I will save, you can ask questions through there as well. I'm keeping an eye on all of them at once. So first question here from Carolyn, who says, first of all, thank you for your commitment to this cause. But how do you look at fellow Australians who appear to be indifferent to this cause that you care about so deeply? And she says, I find myself looking at people in the supermarket or anywhere and thinking, this is happening in your name and you don't care. And it's alienated me from them. So how do you not judge the people around you who don't seem to care? How do we create a narrative that will touch people when Stop the Boats has been so effective? And why are both parties in lockstep on this?
Okay, that's a couple of questions, Hannah. Thank you. Can I start at the end and say that, when I was looking back kind of to 2001 and saying, okay, many prime ministers who people would have otherwise thought didn't have the human capacity to actually keep these people interned. And at some point, normally they would say, look, obviously we don't need to torture these people. We can just bring them here. Because don't forget, it was many, many years ago when the what they call naval interventions or turnback started, in which case for many, many years, boats actually can't get here anyway. And therefore, these people actually didn't need to be locked up. In fact, they never needed to be locked up. But the politicians were saying, well, they need to be locked up for deterrent. They knew that was just an outright lie because no one could get here. And therefore, it just shows that there was political capital in keeping them imprisoned. But when you go back to those who were kind of involved in it, you had Howard, who for Howard, it was political. And I would say, it's just only my view here, it's not a scientific view, but I would say just broadly, it was political and ideological. And then you had a Rudd for who it was political. Gillard, for whom it was political. And what that showed is that the country, those two, I think, were not people who would have generally thought that this was a great idea to put people over there, keep them away from their families, feed them maggot-infested food, keep them on these islands in this extraordinary pain, not provide them with medical treatment or interventions, only constant Panadol, let them rot from the inside out. I don't think that would be the case. But the political environment of Australia was in such a bad place that for them, it would have taken, a different set of skills to get Australia at that point to a place where, we could be humane towards these people that they either didn't possess or they chose not to even attempt, right? So after that, then you had Abbott. Well, for Abbott, it's both political and ideological. You've seen him since he, lost his seat, and in post-prime ministerial life, on many speeches that he's made in the UK, for example, talking about the supposed clash of civilizations and these types of things that you hear from Pauline Hanson, which is essentially saying that, you don't want too many Muslims, because we're all white and Christian and so on. So that's very deeply ideologically driven. And then for Turnbull, I would imagine that it's political, entirely political. And then, you go on to now, which for the present Labor government in Albanese, clearly it's political. And that's because of where Australia is. And once again, I lay a very significant proportion of that blame at the feet of Rupert Murdoch. Okay, because look what happened with Gillian Triggs, for example. Gillian Triggs, the head of the Australian Human Rights Commission at that time. Sorry, Jane?
Oh, I just said I'll never forget that. I watched it, I live streamed it, and I never recovered.
Yeah, and I'm not sure whether she will. I saw her in Geneva a year ago, 18 months ago. She's doing very well as the 2IC of refugees globally under Filippo Grandi. But it must have had an effect on her. So the so the Murdoch press mercilessly, attacked her, and her crime was, at least part of it, was to do a report on Nauru into the treatment of children and the self-harm. And these are children who were becoming catatonic. In fact, Médecins Sans Frontières went there and said, this is the first time in refugee camps anywhere, refugee prisons, that we've seen children literally give up on life and become inert. And this was the level of harm. And yet Gillian Triggs was saying, we shouldn't be doing this under the international law that we have signed up to. And she was just utterly destroyed. So, I don't think Australia should forget all of that. In fact, I think it's a good time now for Australia to be looking back in terms of climate denialism and refugee treatment. Perhaps with refugees, we're not quite there yet, but certainly on climate we are. And those two issues are, people can conflate them together then and say, okay, this is what's been perpetrated on you over the last 20 years. And let's have a think about how you think today and how you've been influenced to think that way. And so that I think is a really critical part of this next parliament, is that we need to get to the heart of where are the messages coming from and what sort of influence does the major news organisation in the country have over the minds of Australians, and essentially what has it done to us? Because in many ways it has really turned us backwards. Sorry, right. I forgot the first half of your question.
Well, your answer was wonderful.
Okay.
Should we have another question, Hannah?
Absolutely. A question here from Jill, all the way from Canada. Hello, welcome, Jill. Thank you for fighting for our friends offshore and in detention. And Jill says, you went to PNG in 2018 to sort of witness the suffering and situation of people who were stranded there in Port Moresby, if I remember correctly. And so no one goes offshore to visit and witness these people suffering. Very few people have done it. And can you perhaps speak to your experience and what you saw? And is that something that you would do again to help re-highlight what these people are going through?
Yes. The reason for doing it is because I wanted to know what I was talking about. I knew that I was going to have to, prosecute this issue publicly. And I wanted to hear from the people themselves, and I wanted to meet them. And I think it's a principle that, we can abide by more. For example, during the last few years, when I would go down to Canberra, I was constantly flabbergasted by senior ministers and their aides and chief of staff and others telling me about the refugees, and the fact, some of them would say in the present government, oh, well, they're better off in these centres or something like this. And I would say, have you actually been there? Have you ever actually gone and spoken to these people and actually seen what it is that you're talking to me? Because I've been there. I'm just asking you, have you been there? And almost to a person, they hadn't. So, I think it's very odd to my thinking that politicians are making these decisions that affect people's lives so fundamentally, and many of them, don't care for whatever reason about these different groups of people. But it should be encouraged that if you want to make a decision about NDIS, you have to go and spend some time, and if you don't have it in your own electorate, you have to go somewhere else and see. And so more people have to ask that question. Have you been there? Well, that's inappropriate. You need to go see these people and hear from them. And so anyway, the other reason is because I wanted to ask these humans, these that we call refugees, I wanted to ask them, what do you want from me? So I didn't want to just make up an example of what I thought should happen. I went to ask them, as damaged as they were, and it was extraordinary to see the levels of harm. People literally drugged 24 hours a day just so they did not have to spend another day with their minds switched on, because they just couldn't deal with the reality. And I fully understood that. And people just walked. There was an Iranian doctor walked up to me and had been there probably 5 years, by that time 6 years, and just kept, and I didn't know he was a doctor. He walked up to me and just kept saying, do you have a resettlement offer for me? Do you have, and he was speaking so slowly, do you have a resettlement, almost slurring his words. And I'd been warned before I went as to, the way that I would interact with these people, because they're, so close to self-harm and have predominantly self-harmed. And it's a field that I'm not an expert in. And so I was very careful. Like, I'm sorry, I don't, there's a person here that you can speak to. Anyway, someone came up to me and asked and said, do you know that he was like a neurosurgeon or something in Iran? And he is just so damaged that he's just popping whatever the pills are that they have, because he can't, the most brilliant brain in the world, he can't switch it on. He must turn it off every day, every hour of every day. And that really struck me. I was in tears when I heard, because when you see that, you have to just say, look, I mean, come on, this is Australia. This is where I'm sitting. I'm here. I have everything that I need. I have a very privileged life. And my country has decided that this is a good idea. Well, you have to participate then. It's not possible to do otherwise. The reason why it was important to see them is because I said, do you want me to call for you to come to Australia, or what is it that you want? And I spoke, I didn't, only had 5 days or something, but I spoke to the predominant leaders, which included Behrez Boushani and Aziz and many of the others that people will know. And they, all of them said, no, we want Australia to accept the New Zealand deal immediately. It's been on the table 6 years by that time. And there's absolutely no reason to not accept it, except that there's still political capital to squeeze out of these poor bodies. And they said, we want to go there, because they were watching Australian politics every day. They're actually far more expert in Australian politics than most Australian politicians, because you can imagine, that their life is in the balance, and they're watching the ministers and they're watching the government. They're watching quite often, parliamentary debate and so on. And they said, we want to go there. So I said, okay, all right, if that's what you want, that's great. So I came back then and raised some money and started to run a campaign about accepting the New Zealand deal, at the same time as obviously advocating for the medevac refugees and others. And that, and some people didn't agree with that, because, if you say that I'm a human rights activist, as ridiculous as that term is, imagine that we have to active for human rights, but we certainly do in Australia at the moment. And I would say, that we need to get these people over to there. That's what they've asked for. And of course, many people in the human rights community and refugee advocacy community, because, well, no, they have a right to be here. And I would say, yeah, I get they have a right to be here. But they're not coming here in the short term, firstly. And secondly, they have asked to go there. And so, that's where this balance always lies. In my view, human rights always comes down to the will and the wish of the people themselves. Okay, they have many rights, but they also have choices and agency. And that was interesting to see that reaction, because because people have been fighting for many years. So I understood it. But many people are saying, oh, no, they're here, bring them here now. And I said, well, they don't want to come here now. They want to go to New Zealand now.
So let's blame them.
Yeah. So it was an interesting process to go through.
You sort of spoke a little bit about some of the ignorance, not just from the ministers up top, but also just all throughout the department, sort of the public service, which sort of leads us into a question nicely from Lisa, who says, do you think that a change of government will really see that culture change for the Immigration Home Affairs Department? Because, obviously the culture comes from the top, from the ministers, but much of the cruelty and the ridiculous financial decisions and the general punitive nature of how it all operates comes from within the departments themselves. Case in point, asylum seekers who are in the Melbourne transit today were whisked away out of nowhere to Christmas Island. How deep does the change need to go, Craig?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Was that your question, or was that a question provided?
Lisa asked that one.
Okay. The change needs to go very deep, because we're talking about, we're talking about a history, intermittent, triggering on this issue, but 20 years of very solid, consistent demonization of a particular cohort, not even a group, just this concept, of a certain type of people coming to Australia. It's going to take a lot of work. You talked before about Ian Chappell, and I should have mentioned also Liz Ellis and Frank Farina and Benny Elias and, so many, Lisa Stelakar, the cricketer, and many, many, many people who've spoken up, and many actors who are very independent of mind and feel much freer than athletes. Even today, it takes quite a bit of courage for athletes to speak out on issues, because sport as an institution tries to shut them down. And so part of my work now moving on is to try and open that up and give athletes in Australia and around the world the tools and the confidence and the understanding that actually it's their right and responsibility to speak up on these broader issues, and that they don't have to stay within their silo of sport, because there's huge pressures on them from sponsors and clubs and other aspects. So all of the former, mostly former legends of a whole variety of sports speaking out was just, absolutely wonderful. It's going to take more of that. It's going to take some, I think, change to media ownership, is also very much at the heart of it. It's going to take advocacy from independents, who hopefully many of them and many of you, find a place in political life in this election. The reason I say that is because my view of Australian politics is that, largely because of the media, it has enabled and empowered the right wing of the Conservative Party, and therefore the moderates haven't had a strong enough voice. And so it's basically lurched, it's lurched on climate, so far to the right, and on refugees way out on the right, where we're actually recalcitrants, in the international domain, that it needs to be brought back. And at the moment, and in fact, the moderates and the sane voices, I would say, but in both major parties, they need assistance to be able to raise their voice.
I think you're exactly right.
Yeah.
And that is the power, I hope, of the independents. And I hope that some of them get in. And I can't help hoping that some progressives, such as me, get in the Senate as well, because we need both to get change.
And we need to shift all of our politics, all of it, back to, centre moderate, centre right, centre left, and let's have sane discussions.
Yeah.
And I've seen that very much through the last few years with the refugees and so on. In the current government, those who are supportive just, don't have the numbers, don't have the ability, don't have the, it's politically difficult for them to be speaking up on it, and therefore, whatever we can bring to life, in my view, at this current time in Australian history, to bring all of our politics back this way is the only way that we're going to move forward, whether that's on climate, refugees, or indeed on women's rights and a whole range of other
federal ICAC and a whole lot of other things. It's almost as if what we're asking for is a return to decency. We've left decency behind in our behaviour, in our politics, in our policy, in our way of behaving, and in our media.
Totally.
And that's what we need to go back to if we're going to, I don't know, maintaining pride and hope.
Yeah.
I think we've reached the end of our time, haven't we, Hannah?
Yeah, that takes us on to 7 o'clock. So we will wrap it up there. But Craig,
Okay.
thank you so much for joining us for the past hour. You have been incredibly insightful, and you are just a wonderful, insightful person, but with such empathy as well. It's been wonderful.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I spoke too much, Jane.
No.
You should have been speaking.
No. People hear enough from me. No. You did not
Okay.
speak too much. What you said is what I think Australia needs to hear. Now, there were, I don't know how many people listening offline, online, and all over the place. Not enough, definitely, for the message that you are sending, but anything I can do to amplify your message, I want to do, because I do think that alongside climate change, our treatment of refugees and Indigenous Australians are the three great black spots in our polity. We have many grey and dark grey spots, but those are the three deep, dark black ones.
Okay.
And I just thank you for joining us, and thank you for your constant, your dogged, and your unstoppable advocacy for people that cannot advocate for themselves. It's God, we need more of you. Thank you,
Jane. That's lovely. It's my pleasure.
And thank you to everyone.
And as always, we will be back again next week doing more of this. We'll also be holding a very special event on Thursday night with all about the Senate, with several Senate candidates and current senators as well, which is going to be fantastic. So make sure you tune in for that one. But until then, thank you, Jane, and thank you again so much, Craig, for joining us.
And thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Hannah.
You are most welcome. See you all next time, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.